The cradle of voices rose from the heart of the Thralis Accord's oldest station like a throat carved from glass, a chamber shaped as a slow upward spiral of translucent quartz platforms suspended in concentric rings around a central column of captured nebula light, so that delegates arriving for session seemed to climb toward their seats through a frozen, luminous storm, the whole structure humming faintly with a resonance older species claimed could still be felt in the bones long after a session ended. It was unlike the newer ceremonial halls built in the centuries since the Accord's founding, one of the station's original chambers, its architecture predating even the concept of formal interspecies law, repurposed over millennia from what archaeological surveys believed had once been a sacred observation deck for a species long extinct, a history that gave the chamber to those who knew it, a weight that felt less like institutional authority and more like inherited obligation. At the human delegation's platform, 3 rings up from the chamber floor, stood Ambassador Thomas Ainsley, 51 years old, lean, gray-eyed, a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades in Earth's foreign service before the stars opened and rewrote the meaning of that career entirely. He wore the plain slate-blue coat of Earth's diplomatic corps, unremarkable beside the ceremonial finery around him, and carried himself with the particular quiet patience of a man who had negotiated water rights between drought-stricken nations long before he had ever negotiated anything among the stars. The patience that the Accord's older species had over 8 years of human membership come to respect without ever quite calling it respect aloud. He had come to the Accord relatively late in his career, recruited not for youth or ambition, but for a rare, hard-earned skill that Earth's early diplomatic corps had learned to prize above almost anything else: the ability to build a case slowly and without fanfare, out of evidence that a more impatient negotiator would have dismissed as too tedious to pursue. Colleagues who had worked beside him on Earth remembered him as a man who read shipping manifests the way other people read novels, who could spend an entire evening cross-referencing tariff filings not because anyone had asked him to, but because he had, somewhere early in his career, decided that the patient accumulation of small, verifiable facts was the only kind of justice that never came apart under pressure. His daughter, grown now and working as an aid coordinator on one of Earth's newer colony worlds, would later say that her father had never once, in her entire childhood, raised his voice in an argument, because he had always believed that a well-documented fact, delivered calmly, did more damage to a bad actor than any amount of shouting ever could. He kept throughout his career a small paper notebook alongside his digital records, a habit colleagues found charmingly old-fashioned until they understood its purpose. A notebook, he liked to say, could not be remotely altered by anyone who had not physically stolen it from his desk. And in a career spent uncovering exactly the kind of manipulation that thrived on digital deniability, he had decided long ago that some truths were worth the inconvenience of ink. Humanity, 8 years into the Accord, had climbed slowly out of the bottom tier of the Council's unspoken hierarchy, its patience and its proven willingness to answer threats decisively having earned it a wary, provisional standing among the mid-rank species, no longer dismissed outright, but still treated in the quiet calculus of interstellar politics as a species whose interests could be safely deprioritized whenever a more established power's interests ran the other way. The session that day concerned a dispute over refined tellurium exports from a mining concern in the Threx Assembly, an insectal confederation of hive cities whose control over 3 of the Accord's rarest refined ores made them, despite a middling military and a reputation for ruthless commercial practice, one of the Council's most quietly indispensable members. Ainsley had spent 4 months building a case that Threx trade brokers were manipulating tellurium futures to strangle smaller species fusion industries, a case built on patient, unglamorous forensic accounting, cross-reference shipping manifests, quietly obtained pricing records from 3 independent trade auditors, a pattern of deliberately staggered deliveries that taken individually looked like ordinary commercial friction, but that Ainsley had methodically assembled. Over 4 months of evenings spent alone in the embassy's records archive, into an unmistakable picture of coordinated market manipulation, designed to bankrupt fusion cooperatives on 6 smaller member worlds simultaneously. The case, once complete, would have been damning enough to trigger formal accords sanct. Ions against the Responsible Trade Network, a fact Ainsley had confided only to Marsh and to 2 of his most trusted staff precisely because he understood, with the same instinct that had once told him which shipping delays in his old Earth career concealed genuine crises rather than ordinary bureaucratic friction, that the network's architect would not take the threat lightly once he realized how close the case had come to completion. That architect, Ainsley's own private notes would later reveal, was a broad-shouldered, chitin-plated broker named Hesk Vorn, senior trade delegate of the Threx Assembly, whose compound eyes had begun tracking Ainsley across the chamber floor, in the final week of the investigation, with an unblinking, unreadable attention that made more than one nearby delegate shift uneasily in their seats. Ambassador Ainsley continues to pursue accusations without proof, Vorn said, his translated voice carrying a dry, clicking undertone that no software fully smoothed away. I would advise him, as a courtesy between trading partners, to consider how costly proof can become for those who go looking for it in the wrong places. It was not, on its face, a threat any council record would classify as one vague enough to survive scrutiny, phrased with just enough commercial ambiguity to be dismissed later as an idiom lost in translation. But Ainsley, who had spent 2 decades learning to hear exactly this kind of warning beneath exactly this kind of politeness, held Vorn's compound gaze for a long moment before answering. I've found, Ainsley said evenly, that proof usually costs less than the alternative delegate Vorn. I intend to keep looking. He did not know, as he said it, that he had 1 week left to live. 6 days later, Ambassador Thomas Ainsley's body was found in an unmonitored service corridor on the outer ring of a Threx-administered trade platform, 3 jumps from the Accord's central station, where he had traveled, against the strong private objection of his own security staff, to personally review shipping manifests he believed would complete his case against Vorn's trade network. The Threx Platform Administration reported the death within hours as an industrial accident, a ruptured coolant line, a body found alone, no witnesses, no surveillance footage from a section of the platform whose monitoring systems had, according to the official incident report, been offline for scheduled maintenance at the precise hour of his death. Deputy Ambassador Alina Marsh, 44, Ainsley's second-in-command for the past 3 years, was the one who received the notification, alone at 4 in the morning station time, and who had to decide in the disoriented first minutes after reading it whether grief or suspicion should come first. She chose suspicion because grief, she understood even then, was a luxury that would still be waiting for her whenever she finally had time to afford it, and because everything about the report's careful, convenient gaps told her, with the certainty of someone who had worked beside Ainsley long enough to know exactly how he operated, that this had not been an accident at all. She had known Ainsley for 3 years, long enough to have absorbed, almost without noticing, the particular rhythms of his caution, the way he never traveled to a sensitive meeting without filing a detailed itinerary with at least 2 members of his staff, the way he had, on more than one occasion, delayed a trip by a full day simply because a security assessment had come back with language he found insufficiently precise. A man that careful did not die of an unmonitored coolant rupture by coincidence, and Marsh, sitting alone in her quarters at 4 in the morning with the notification still open on her data slate, felt the particular cold clarity that she would later describe to her own staff as grief temporarily converted into fuel, because she had not yet earned the right to feel anything else until the people responsible had a name. She dressed, made coffee she did not drink, and was seated at her desk reviewing the incident report's every inconsistency before the station's artificial dawn cycle had even begun to lighten the corridors outside her quarters. What happened in the 7 days that followed would be studied, decades later, as the moment humanity's relationship with the Thralis Accord changed permanently, not through any single dramatic act, but through a quiet, deliberate withdrawal of patience that the rest of the galaxy would spend years trying to fully understand. Marsh did not wait for the Council's condolence session to conclude before she began building a case of her own. She convened the embassy's senior staff within the hour, in the same cramped, overcapacity operations deck that 8 years of unglamorous growth had never quite managed to expand, and laid out without softening exactly what she believed had happened and exactly what she intended to do about it. The room she gathered them in had, over the years, accumulated the particular clutter of a workspace that had outgrown its original footprint several times over without ever being granted a proper renovation. Data terminals bolted onto surfaces never designed for them. A wall of commendations and mission patches that told, to anyone who knew how to read it, the quiet history of every crisis Earth's delegation had weathered since its earliest, most improvised years. Ainsley's own desk, visible through the open door of his adjoining office, still held a half-finished cup of tea from the morning before his departure, and more than one member of staff found themselves glancing toward it during the meeting, unable to help it, before forcing their attention back to Marsh. Someone would eventually have to decide what to do with that cup, with the notebook still open on his desk to a half-finished page of figures, with all the small, ordinary evidence of a life interrupted mid-sentence. But nobody in that room was prepared that night to be the one who moved it. "The maintenance report is fabricated," she said. "Coolant systems on a platform that size don't lose surveillance coverage across an entire service ring for 6 hours by coincidence, and they certainly don't lose it in the precise window a man carrying evidence against their largest trade broker happened to be walking through it alone. I want forensic access to that platform systems. I want it through official council channels first, because I intend to do this correctly, on the record, in a way that cannot later be dismissed as human overreach. But I want everyone in this room to understand that I am not optimistic the council will grant it quickly, or at all." She was right to be pessimistic, though even she had not fully anticipated how completely the council would fail her in the days that followed. The formal request for a joint forensic investigation, filed within 18 hours of Ainsley's death, moved through the Accord's judicial directorate with a sluggishness that Marsh's own legal staff described, in private, as unprecedented even by the council's usual standards. Procedural objections arrived from 3 separate committees, each citing a different technicality, jurisdictional ambiguity over crimes committed aboard privately administered trade platforms, a supposed conflict of interest concern regarding human investigators examining Threx infrastructure, a request for additional documentation that the Threx Assembly's own legal counsel, filing swiftly and aggressively, insisted was required before any external access could even be considered. Marsh's legal staff, led by a sharp, exhausted attorney named Farrow who had transferred to the embassy 2 years earlier from Earth's own international courts, tracked each objection's timeline with mounting frustration. The first, a jurisdictional challenge filed by the Judicial Directorate's own procedural office, took 11 hours to draft and file, 11 hours during which, Farrow noted bitterly in a memo Marsh kept afterward, the platform's own maintenance crews had continued routine operations that risked overwriting exactly the kind of system logs any genuine investigation would need intact. The second objection, filed by a delegation whose fusion industries depended heavily on uninterrupted tellurium imports, framed itself as a neutral procedural concern about human jurisdiction, but read, to anyone paying attention, as a thinly veiled request that the matter simply be allowed to disappear before it disrupted anyone's supply contracts. Farrow began keeping, alongside her formal filings, a private log of every hour lost to each objection, a habit she later admitted had started less as useful documentation than as a way of channeling her own mounting anger into something productive, rather than letting it curdle into the kind of despair that made good lawyers stop fighting altogether. By the fourth day, it had become unmistakably clear to Marsh and to every member of her staff that the council was not merely moving slowly. It was declining to act at all, dressed in enough procedural language to avoid ever having to say so plainly. On the evening of that fourth day, a delegate Marsh had never before spoken with privately, a slow, deliberate representative of the ossuary choir named Vel Amranu, whose species communicated in resonant harmonics that most delegates found more comfortable to receive through translation than in person, requested a quiet meeting in a small alcove off the Cradle of Voices main chamber. Amranu had watched over 3 centuries of choir membership in the accord, this exact procedural pattern play out for smaller species more than once, and had come, he explained through his translator's low, humming cadence, not to offer help the choir was not authorized to give, but to offer the one thing he could, a warning born of long, painful experience. He arrived without any of his species' customary ceremonial escort, a choice Marsh understood only later as its own quiet signal that this conversation was meant to exist outside the choir's own official channels, just as surely as her investigation was coming to exist outside the council's. The council will not act on its own timeline, Amranu told her. It will act only when the cost of continued silence becomes higher than the cost of continued trade with the Threx Assembly. I do not say this to discourage you, Ambassador Marsh. I say it because my own species learned this lesson 3 centuries ago at a cost I would not wish repeated. If you wait for this body's conscience to move faster than its ledger, you will wait considerably longer than the evidence you need can survive. Marsh thanked him and did not tell him that evening that Reyes Alvarez's team was already 3 days into an operation built entirely around the same conclusion. But she carried Amranu's warning with her for the rest of that crisis, and long after it, as confirmation that the pattern she had recognized in 6 days of stonewalling was not new and not unique to her own species' grief. She would, in later years, invite Amranu personally to the embassy's own briefings whenever a new crisis threatened to repeat the same institutional pattern, and he came each time patient and precise, offering the same quiet, hard-won wisdom of a species that had learned, at great cost, exactly how a council's convenience could masquerade as its conscience. 3 separate delegations, species whose own industries depended heavily on Threx refined or exports, quietly signaled, through back-channel diplomatic contacts, that they would not support any measure likely to disrupt trade relations with the Assembly over what one delegate, in a remark that reached Marsh's ears within hours of being spoken, called an unfortunate accident involving an overzealous junior diplomat. The wider Accord's public reaction in those same 4 days told a very different story than the Council's private procedural maneuvering. Independent news feeds across a dozen member worlds picked up the story within 48 hours of Ainsley's death, running detailed profiles of his career, his water rights work on Earth, the quiet diligence of the tellurium case he had died pursuing, coverage that built a groundswell of public sympathy the Council's procedural committees seemed entirely unprepared to account for, insulated as they were from ordinary Accord citizens by layers of diplomatic distance. Marsh noted with grim interest that the growing public pressure did nothing to accelerate the Council's formal response, a fact that told her, more clearly than any procedural memo could have, exactly how little the Council's actual decision-making answered to the species it nominally served. Ainsley had been 51 years old, had negotiated 3 water rights treaties that prevented armed conflict between nations on a planet not his own, had spent 4 months building a case that would have protected a dozen smaller species from a trade practice designed to strangle their industries quietly and legally. He had been called by a council that could not be bothered to open a formal inquiry into his death, an overzealous junior diplomat. Marsh read that quote 3 times before she set the report down, and something in her in that moment went very still and very cold in a way that her staff would later describe carefully as the exact opposite of losing her temper. She had known Ainsley long enough to remember Specifically, the evening he had shown her the first anomaly in the tellurium pricing data 3 years earlier. Both of them still knew enough to their posts that the discovery had felt almost like a game, a puzzle they were solving together rather than a case that would eventually cost him his life. He had been meticulous even then, cross-checking the same figures twice before he would let himself believe them, because he had told her more than once that a diplomat who overstated his evidence even slightly gave every bad actor he ever confronted a permanent excuse to dismiss everything else he said. He had never once in 3 years overstated anything. And now a council that had never bothered to read a single page of his 4 months of work was calling him overzealous. In a memo none of them expected a grieving deputy to ever see. She called an emergency session of her own senior staff that night, not the council's staff, not any accord body with jurisdiction to grant or withhold permission, but the small, close-knit core of people who had spent 8 years building Earth's presence among the stars out of persistence and unglamorous competence, in a delegation that had learned, from its very first humiliating tariff dispute, never to wait for anyone else's permission to protect its own. She stood at the same hollowed table where Ainsley had once briefed H. 3 years earlier on his very first tellurium pricing anomaly, back when the case had still looked like nothing more than ordinary market friction, and found herself, for a brief unguarded moment before she began speaking, unable to entirely separate the grief from the fury, the two feelings sitting together in her chest with an intensity that made her voice, when she finally used it, come out quieter and more controlled than she had planned. Precisely because she did not trust herself to speak any louder without it cracking. "I want to be clear about what I am about to propose," Marsh told the room, "because I will not ask anyone in this deck to participate in something they have not chosen with full understanding of the cost. The Council has made its position clear. They will not investigate, they will not prosecute. They have in every practical sense told the Threx Assembly that a human diplomat's murder is an acceptable cost of doing business, provided the trade relationship remains undisturbed. I do not intend to accept that as the final word on Thomas Ainsley's death. I intend for humanity to conduct its own investigation, gather its own evidence, and pursue its own justice, through whatever channels prove necessary, whether or not this council ever grants us its blessing to do so." Commander Diego Reyes Alvarez, the embassy's senior intelligence officer, no relation to the survey captain whose own ordeal, years earlier and in a different sector entirely, had already become required reading in Earth's own crisis response academies, asked the question that hung over the room. He had served under 3 previous ambassadors in his 11 years at the embassy, had watched more than one diplomatic crisis resolve itself through patient negotiation rather than unilateral action, and he did not ask the question lightly, nor did he ask it to obstruct. And if that means acting inside Threx-administered space without council authorization, that's not a gray area, ma'am. That's the kind of unilateral action that could get humanity's Accord membership suspended outright, murder or no murder. "I am aware," Marsh said. "I have weighed that risk against the alternative, which is a council that has just demonstrated in writing that it will let any sufficiently valuable trade partner murder our people without consequence, provided the killing is dressed convincingly enough as an accident. If that is the price of good standing in this accord, I am no longer certain the standing is worth what it costs us to keep it. I would rather answer for unauthorized action than explain to the next diplomat we send into that region why we let the last one's death go unanswered." Reyes Alvarez held her gaze for a long moment, weighing, she could see, not the wisdom of the plan itself but his own willingness to carry it out, and then gave the same small, decisive nod she had watched him give on 2 smaller crises before this one, a gesture that had, over 3 years of working alongside him, come to mean that whatever doubts he carried into a decision, he would carry the execution of it flawlessly regardless. Nobody in the room argued further. Reyes Alvarez simply nodded once and began issuing assignments, and the machinery of a very different kind of response, Not a rescue this time, but a reckoning began to turn. The investigation moved on two fronts simultaneously. The first, quieter and more painstaking, fell to a small forensic team led by Dr. Amara Chen, the embassy's chief technical analyst, who had spent 3 years building relationships with independent shipping contractors across a dozen Accord trade routes specifically because she had long suspected, in the particular unglamorous paranoia of someone who had spent a career studying supply chains, that Earth would eventually need eyes in places the Council's official channels could never reach. Chen had joined the embassy shortly after Ainsley's own arrival, recruited for a doctorate in logistics forensics that most of her Earthside colleagues had considered a peculiar, faintly obsessive specialty until the day it proved, in this crisis as in three smaller ones before it, to be exactly the quiet expertise the embassy needed most. She had, in her years at the embassy, developed a private working philosophy that she shared with new hires on their first day. That the truth about any organization's real priorities was never written in its official statements, only in the unglamorous gaps between what it claimed to track and what it actually bothered to record, and that a patient enough analyst could always find, somewhere in those gaps, the shape of what someone was trying to hide. Two of those contractors, humans and non-humans alike who had quietly done business with the Threx assembly for years and had grown privately uneasy with the Confederation's more ruthless practices, agreed, at real personal risk, to smuggle out partial maintenance logs from the trade platform where Ainsley had died. One of them, a weathered independent hauler captain named Osai Larbai, who had known Ainsley personally from a minor cargo dispute the ambassador had once resolved fairly in his favor years earlier, risked his entire operating license by rerouting a scheduled cargo run specifically to make contact with Chen's team, delivering the data personally rather than trusting any remote transfer that Threx security might intercept. Larbai had built his entire independent hauling business over 15 years, on a reputation for absolute discretion with every party he worked for, human and alien alike, and the decision to break that discretion now. For a diplomat he had met only once years earlier over a dispute involving a single delayed cargo shipment was not one he made lightly. He told Chen later that he had spent 2 full days weighing the decision before finally rerouting his ship, aware that a wrong guess about Threx Security's attentiveness could end not just his license but quite possibly his life. The man settled my dispute in an afternoon when Threx arbitrators would have taken a year, Larbai told Chen when she asked carefully whether he understood the risk he was taking. I don't forget that kind of thing. The second front, more dangerous and considerably more direct, fell to a small team led personally by Reyes Alvarez. 3 operatives, trained in the same unglamorous doctrine of patience and precision that had, in separate crises years apart, once saved a kidnapped child and a captured survey crew, dispatched under deep cover aboard a chartered independent freighter with false registration, bound for the same trade platform where Ainsley had died, carrying orders that were, by design, deliberately narrow, locate physical evidence of the sabotage, identify the individuals responsible, and extract both without triggering an incident that Threx security forces could credibly frame as an armed incursion. It took 4 days. Dr. Chen's smuggled logs, when finally decrypted and cross-referenced against the platform's official incident report, revealed exactly what Marsh had suspected from the first hour. The surveillance blackout in the service corridor where Ainsley died had not been a maintenance failure at all, but a deliberate override initiated from a terminal registered to a Threx security contractor with a documented history of working, off the books, for Hesk Vorn's trade network. The coolant rupture that had supposedly killed Ainsley showed, on closer forensic analysis of the smuggled maintenance data, chemical signatures inconsistent with genuine accidental failure and entirely consistent with a deliberately triggered release, timed with a precision that no accident could plausibly explain. Chen spent nearly 11 hours confirming that finding before she was willing to report it to Marsh, running the same analysis through 3 independent modeling approaches specifically because she understood with the same instinct for rigor that had made her useful to this embassy for 3 years. That a case built on a single uncorroborated technical claim would collapse the moment Threx counsel challenged it before a tribunal. Reyes Alvarez's team, meanwhile, had spent 3 days building a careful picture of the platform's security architecture, patient in a way that mirrored every earlier lesson Earth's crisis doctrine had learned the hard way. That a target confident in its own impunity rarely bothers to guard its unglamorous edges as carefully as its ceremonial center. They moved through the platform posing as independent maintenance contractors, a cover built on genuine credentials Chen's smuggled network had helped arrange, gathering information in small, patient increments. A conversation overheard in a dockworker's commissary, a duty roster glimpsed on an unattended terminal. The slow accumulation of small facts that, taken together, mapped a picture no single observation could have provided alone. The team's approach to the platform itself carried its own quiet tension, distinct from anything a boarding operation against a warship might have demanded but dangerous in its own unglamorous way. 3 operatives posing as contractors aboard a station that, unlike a military vessel, was crowded with ordinary civilian traffic, any one of whom might notice an inconsistency in a forged credential or an unfamiliar face lingering too long near a restricted access point. Reyes Alvarez had insisted, over the objection of one younger team member eager to move faster, that they spend their first full day doing nothing but observing, learning the platform's actual rhythms rather than the rhythms its official documentation claimed it kept, because he had learned in 11 years of intelligence work that the difference between a plan surviving contact and a plan collapsing at the first checkpoint usually came down to exactly that kind of unglamorous patience. Why mapped shift changes, noted which corridors carried genuine foot traffic against which merely appeared on schematics, and identified by the end of that first day that the platform's security apparatus, like the show's reckoning years earlier in a different sector entirely, guarded its ceremonial levels with far more attention than it spared its unglamorous working decks. A pattern Reyes Alvarez noted in his own report afterward. That seemed to recur across an unsettling number of the galaxy's more hierarchical cultures, as though the impulse to protect appearances always outpaced the impulse to protect substance. On the fourth night, they located the security contractor whose terminal had triggered the surveillance blackout, a nervous, mid-level Threx operative named Jesk Orun, who lived alone in a modest maintenance-tier residence 3 decks below the platform's ceremonial levels. A detail Reyes Alvarez's team had confirmed carried real significance in Threx social hierarchy, since it marked Orun as exactly the kind of expendable mid-level operative a network like Vorn's would use for precisely this sort of deniable task. Orun did not resist when the team made contact. He had, by his own later account, been unable to sleep properly since the night of Ainsley's death, and something in him seemed almost relieved to finally be confronted with the consequences of what he had agreed to do. Under careful, non-coercive questioning conducted with a certified translator and full awareness of Accord evidentiary standards, a distinction Reyes Alvarez insisted on documenting meticulously, understanding that any hint of coercion would give Threx counsel exactly the procedural opening they needed to discredit the entire case. Orun described being paid a substantial sum by intermediaries connected to Vorn's network specifically to disable monitoring in the service corridor during the exact window of Ainsley's visit, though he insisted, with what Reyes Alvarez's report described as apparently genuine distress, that he had believed the assignment was meant only to prevent Ainsley from photographing certain shipping manifests, not to facilitate a killing. "They told me it was to protect a trade secret," Orun said through the translator, his voice small. "I did not know what they intended for him. I want that understood whatever happens to me now." Reyes Alvarez, watching the exchange, made a judgment call that would matter enormously in the months ahead. Rather than pressing Orun further in that first encounter, he offered him a choice, plainly stated, recorded in full for the eventual record: cooperate fully and voluntarily with a formal Accord inquiry, under whatever protections the tribunal process could offer, or continue on as he was, carrying alone whatever consequence eventually found him regardless of his own intentions. Zoran did not answer immediately. He sat in silence for nearly a full minute by Reyes Alvarez's own account before finally asking only one question in return: whether cooperating would mean Ainsley's family would know eventually exactly what had been done to him and why. Told that it would, Orun agreed. Whether Orun's claimed ignorance of the murder itself was true or convenient, the evidence he provided, transaction records, a recorded conversation with an intermediary discussing payment for the surveillance override, physical access logs proving his presence at the relevant terminal, was, combined with Dr. Chen's forensic analysis of the coolant system, more than sufficient to establish, beyond any reasonable dispute, that Thomas Ainsley's death had been a deliberate assassination rather than an accident, and that the chain of responsibility led, however many intermediaries removed, directly back to Hesk Vorn's trade network. Marsh received the complete evidence package on the sixth day, and spent the following 12 hours doing something that surprised even her own staff. Rather than immediately demanding a new council session, she requested, and was granted, a private meeting with the Thralis Accord's senior judicial magistrate, an ancient, deliberate being named Korvath Thralon, one of the last living members of the species that had founded the Accord itself, whose personal authority, though rarely invoked, still carried weight the council's ordinary procedural committees could not easily override. Korvath Thralon received her in a small, unadorned chamber far removed from the ceremonial grandeur of the Cradle of Voices, a room whose plainness Marsh understood, the moment she stepped into it, as a deliberate choice rather than an oversight, the magistrate's way of stripping every meeting held there of the theater that so often substituted, elsewhere in the Accord, for genuine deliberation. He was old even by the standards of a species whose lifespans ran to centuries, his movements slow and considered, but his attention, when he finally turned it fully on the evidence Marsh laid before him, was absolute. He had presided over the Accord's judicial functions for longer than most member species had held membership at all, had watched empires rise and dissolve and reform themselves within this same station's walls, and carried, in the particular unhurried gravity of his manner, the accumulated weight of having seen nearly every variation of institutional failure the Accord's long history could produce, and having, on more occasions than the official record cared to preserve, quietly corrected a few of them himself. "I did not come here to ask you to open an investigation," Marsh told the magistrate, laying the full evidence package before him without preamble. "I came here to inform you that I already have. Everything you see here was gathered without council authorization because your council declined repeatedly and in writing to authorize it. I am not seeking your permission for what has already been done. I am asking whether this body intends to act on the evidence now that it exists, or whether it intends to continue treating a documented murder as an unfortunate accident, in which case I will proceed to make certain the entire Accord, and every trade partner who has ever wondered how safe their own diplomats are among this council's more indispensable members, understands exactly what happened here and exactly how this council chose to respond to it." Korvath Thralon studied the evidence for a long, silent while, his ancient, multifaceted eyes moving across each document with a deliberateness that made even Marsh's carefully rehearsed patience strain. He read Orun's testimony twice, she noted, and paused longest over Dr. Chen's forensic analysis of the coolant chemistry, as though he found some old, personal echo in the particular betrayal of a system quietly turned into a weapon by people who understood it better than the man it killed. "You understand," he said finally, "that what you describe, an unauthorized investigation conducted inside another member species' administered territory, involving what appears to be the detention and questioning of a Threx national, constitutes, under a strict reading of this Accord's charter, a violation serious enough to justify sanctions against your own delegation, regardless of what your evidence proves." "I am aware," Marsh said, I would ask you to weigh that violation against the one this council has already committed by allowing 6 days to pass without opening a single formal inquiry into the murder of one of its own member species diplomats. I did not come here to argue that my actions were without cost. I came here to argue that the alternative, waiting patiently while the evidence went cold, and the council's convenient procedural delays quietly buried a murder, would have cost something this accord cannot afford to lose: the confidence of every smaller species watching to see whether membership in this council actually protects them or merely obligates them to grieve quietly when it doesn't. The magistrate was silent for a long moment more, long enough that Marsh began to wonder whether she had misjudged the entire approach, whether an appeal to an ancient founder's personal sense of institutional integrity had been, in the end, no more effective than the procedural channels that had already failed her. Then Corvath Threlun rose slowly from his seat and said only, "Bring your evidence to the full council tomorrow. I will see that the session happens, and I will see that it happens with my own authority behind it, so that no committee finds a technicality to delay it further. What the council does with what you show them will then be theirs to answer for, not yours." The full council convened an emergency session on the seventh day, called not by any Threx delegation eager to resolve the matter, but by Magistrate Threlun himself, invoking an authority so rarely used that half the chamber's protocol officers had to consult centuries-old procedural archives simply to confirm the session's legitimacy. The cradle of voices filled well beyond its ordinary capacity. Delegations that had ignored the previous week's quiet procedural maneuvering arriving now in numbers that made clear how thoroughly word of the coming confrontation had already spread through the station's informal channels. Delegates who had not attended a session together in months found themselves crowded onto adjoining quartz platforms, the chamber's ancient resonance humming faintly beneath the low murmur of 100 conversations conducted in 100 languages, all of them, in one form or another, asking the same question: whether the body that governed their shared space among the stars still governed by principle, or merely by whichever principle happened to be convenient that week. Marsh presented the evidence in full: the smuggled maintenance logs, the forensic coolant analysis, Orun's recorded testimony, the financial ill-connecting the surveillance override to Vorn's trade network, laid out with the same unhurried, methodical precision that Ainsley himself had once brought to his 4-month investigation into tellurium futures. A quiet, deliberate irony that was not lost on anyone in the chamber who had known him. She did not raise her voice once during the presentation, understanding, as Ainsley had always understood, that a case built on verified fact needed no theater to land its full weight. Hesk Vorn, present in the chamber and visibly unsettled for the first time since anyone on the human delegation had known him, attempted a defense built around exactly the kind of procedural technicality that had shielded the council's inaction for the previous 6 days: that the evidence had been gathered through unauthorized means, that Orun's testimony had been obtained without proper Threx legal representation, that the entire investigation constituted an illegitimate incursion that should be dismissed on procedural grounds regardless of its substantive findings. His compound eyes, delegates seated nearby would later remark, no longer carried the unblinking, unreadable confidence that had once made junior diplomats shift uneasily in their seats. Something in the chamber's collective attention had visibly rattled him in a way that 4 months of Ainsley's patient accounting never had. He repeated the word unauthorized 4 times in the span of his brief statement, a pattern the chamber's own protocol analysts would note afterward as characteristic of a defendant who understood, on some level beneath his own rehearsed confidence, that the substance of the case against him was no longer meaningfully in dispute. It was Magistrate Threlun himself who ended that argument, in a ruling that would be cited for decades afterward in accord jurisprudence. "This body's own procedural delay," he said, his ancient voice carrying without need of amplification through the entire spiraling chamber, created the very circumstances under which this evidence had to be gathered outside official channels. A council that will not investigate a murder within 6 days does not retain the standing to complain, on the 7th, that someone else finally did. I will not permit this chamber to hide behind the very failure that made this evidence necessary. The council voted in the end 94-12 to open a full tribunal investigation into Heskvorn's trade network, and in a separate closely watched vote that would prove even more consequential for the Accord's long-term governance, to establish, for the first time in the Accord's history, a mandatory 48-hour response window for any formal request to investigate the death of a council delegate, a reform that Marsh had not originally sought but that emerged almost inevitably from a council desperate to demonstrate it had learned something from the 6 days of inaction that had preceded it. The 12 dissenting votes came, unsurprisingly, from delegations whose own trade relationships depended most heavily on maintaining cordial relations with the Threx Assembly, a fact that several news feeds across the Accord noted pointedly in their coverage of the session. Several running the 12 dissenting delegations' own trade figures with the Assembly alongside the vote tally, without further comment, letting the numbers speak for themselves in a way no editorial could have matched. The debate preceding the vote ran nearly 6 hours, considerably longer than any procedural reform in recent Accord memory, as delegation after delegation rose to explain, with varying degrees of candor, why a 48-hour mandate might prove either essential or unworkable. One delegate from a species whose own bureaucracy prized deliberation over speed argued, not without some sympathy from the chamber, that hasty investigations risked producing hasty injustices of their own. Another, representing a small agricultural collective that had lost 2 of its own trade envoys to similarly unresolved incidents over the preceding decade, rose only to say, briefly and without elaboration, that her own species would have given a great deal for exactly the mandate now under debate, and that she found it difficult to weigh theoretical risks of haste against the very real, very documented cost of delay her own people had already paid twice over. Magistrate Threlun, breaking his own customary silence during ordinary council debate, responded to the deliberation argument directly. A 48-hour window does not mandate a hasty conclusion. It mandates only that the looking begin before the evidence disappears. I have sat on this bench long enough to know the difference between careful deliberation and convenient delay, and I would ask this chamber to learn to recognize that difference as well, before it costs another delegation what it has already cost this one. The remark, delegates who were present would LD later recall, seemed to settle something in the room that 6 hours of procedural argument had failed to settle on its own. The tribunal that followed took 8 months to conclude, considerably faster than the 14 months a very different case years earlier had required, in part because the Threx Assembly's own Civilian Trade Council, alarmed by the reputational damage Vorn's network had inflicted on their entire species standing before the wider Accord, moved swiftly to distance itself from him, cooperating with the tribunal in ways that surprised even Marsh's own legal staff. The Civilian Council's cooperation was not entirely selfless. Internal Threx politics, Marsh's intelligence briefings revealed, had long chafed under the outsized influence commercial brokers like Vorn wielded over assembly governance, and his exposure gave reform-minded civilian delegates an opening they had waited years for, much as a similar internal shift had once turned a different species against a warlord whose ambitions had grown too costly to keep protecting. Chen's forensic division, in the months that followed, quietly assisted the reform faction in auditing a dozen other Threx trade contracts for similar irregularities, work that produced no further prosecutions but that Marsh understood, watching from a careful diplomatic distance, was doing more to prevent the next Vorn than any single conviction ever could on its own. Vorn himself was convicted of ordering Ainsley's assassination, along with 2 intermediaries whose testimony, once the tribunal's protections made cooperation safer than continued loyalty, filled in the remaining gaps in the case Marsh's team had built in a single desperate week. He offered no statement at his sentencing beyond a brief clicking assertion that he had acted to protect a trade network worth more, in his estimation, than any single diplomat's life. A defense that did nothing to soften his sentence, and if anything, hardened the tribunal panel's resolve to impose the maximum penalty available under the joint Accord-Threx legal framework negotiated specifically for his case. Marsh attended the sentencing herself, though she had not been required to, and found when the panel finally read the verdict aloud that she felt none of the release she had half expected. Only a quiet, settled confirmation that the work had been done correctly, evidence laid against fact until nothing remained standing that a competent defense could shake loose. Exactly the way Ainsley himself would have built the case if he had lived to finish it. Jesk Orun, whose cooperation had proven instrumental despite his own culpability in the surveillance override, received a reduced sentence under a limited immunity arrangement that Marsh herself had personally advocated for, arguing before the tribunal that a system which punished cooperation as harshly as concealment would never again find a witness willing to come forward. He served 3 years under a supervised release program on a Threx civilian world, and Marsh, in a gesture that surprised her own staff, made a point of reading his annual compliance reports personally, understanding better than most that the line between a frightened accomplice and a willing conspirator was one worth taking seriously rather than erasing for the sake of a tidier verdict. The tribunal's proceedings themselves, held over 8 months in a chamber considerably less grand than the Cradle of Voices, produced one moment that Marsh would return to often in the years afterward. Osei Larbai, the independent hauler captain who had risked his operating license to smuggle Dr. Chen's maintenance logs off the platform, testified in person, describing without embellishment the afternoon years earlier when Ainsley had resolved his cargo dispute fairly rather than deferring, as most Accord arbitrators did, to the larger and more politically connected party. I did not smuggle those records because I believed in some grand principle of justice, Larbai told the tribunal panel through a translator that struggled briefly with the particular weariness in his voice. I did it because a man who did not know me from any other hauler in this sector once took an afternoon to make sure I was treated fairly. I thought that deserved an afternoon of risk in return. The tribunal panel entered no further questions after that testimony, and Marsh, seated in the gallery, found she could not immediately speak either. 5 years later, Ambassador Elena Marsh, she had taken the title formally within a year of Ainsley's death, the council's own emergency session having made the succession a formality rather than a contest, returned to the Cradle of Voices. The chamber's frozen nebula storm still spun in slow, silent light at its center. The quartz platforms still rose in their concentric spiral, though the session that day was smaller, quieter, called not to resolve any new crisis, but to mark the 5th anniversary of the Accord's Rapid Inquiry Charter, the formal name the 48-hour reform had eventually taken. Now cited, Marsh had learned with a certain grim satisfaction, in a dozen unrelated proceedings entirely unconnected to the case that had first produced it, wherever a smaller species needed to invoke the council's obligation to act rather than delay. In the years between, the embassy's small operations deck had grown into something Ainsley himself would scarcely have recognized, not larger in raw numbers so much as more deliberately structured, with Dr. Chen now heading a formally recognized forensic division that other Accord member species had in the years since begun quietly consulting for their own investigations, and Commander Reyes Alvarez promoted twice, overseeing an intelligence directorate whose doctrine of patient, narrowly scoped investigation had become, alongside an earlier and more dramatic doctrine born of a very different crisis, one of the 2 pillars Earth's crisis response training now built new officers around. Farrow, the exhausted attorney who had once tracked every procedural delay hour by furious hour, had gone on to help draft the Rapid Inquiry Charter's final legal language personally, a fact she mentioned, when asked, with the particular quiet pride of someone who had turned a week of fury into something that would outlast her own career. Farrow had also, in the years since, become something of an informal mentor to junior legal staff arriving fresh from Earth's own courts, and she made a point, every year around the anniversary, of walking new arrivals through the full timeline of those original 7 days. Not as a triumphant story, she always insisted, but as a cautionary one. A reminder that the Council's institutions could fail exactly as badly the next time unless someone remained willing to notice the failure while it was still happening rather than after the fact. The lesson isn't that we won, she would tell them. The lesson is that winning required someone to notice the loss while there was still time to answer it. Don't wait for the post-mortem. Notice it while it's happening. Ainsley's daughter, Clara, now in her early 30s and still working as an aide coordinator on Earth's newer colony worlds, had flown in for the anniversary session at Marsh's personal invitation, and the two women had spent the previous evening together in Marsh's quarters, sharing a meal and a silence that had over 5 years become comfortable rather than painful. Clara had told her that evening about a conversation she still remembered from her childhood, her father explaining why he never raised his voice in an argument, that a well-documented fact delivered calmly did more damage to a bad actor than any amount of shouting ever could. "I used to think that was just a personality quirk," Clara said. "I understand now it was the whole philosophy. You built an entire case out of it after he died. I think that would have meant more to him than any of the rest of it." Clara had asked her, near the end of that evening, a question she had apparently been carrying for years, but had never quite found the moment to voice: whether Marsh ever regretted the choice to act without council authorization, given how easily the entire investigation could have collapsed under formal sanction before it ever produced a single piece of usable evidence. Marsh had considered the question longer than she considered most questions before answering it. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I do not regret the choice itself. Your father spent his whole career believing that patience and proof together were stronger than any threat aimed at either of them. I have spent 5 years trying to prove that belief could survive contact with an institution that preferred convenience to courage. Some nights I still don't know if I've fully succeeded. But I know I would rather have tried and failed than have let his death simply become one more quiet line in a maintenance log nobody ever read again." She did not speak long. She never had reason to. Marsh had learned in the years since taking Ainsley's post that the address itself mattered less than the plain fact of showing up to give it. Before the session began, she had found a quiet moment in the antechamber outside the Cradle of Voices with Reyes Alvarez and Dr. Chen, both of whom had traveled in specifically for the anniversary, despite their own expanded responsibilities elsewhere in the embassy's growing structure. Chen, running a hand absently along the edge of a data slate she no longer needed for this meeting. Out of a habit, 5 years of forensic work had never quite worn off her. Asked the question none of them had spoken aloud since the tribunal's final verdict. "Do you ever wonder if we'd have found all of it anyway?" Chen asked. "Through the proper channels, I mean, if the council had just opened the inquiry on day one the way they were supposed to." Marsh considered the question with the same care she gave every question that actually mattered. "I used to wonder that constantly," she said. "I don't anymore. I think a proper channel that takes 6 days to even begin looking would have found nothing at all because nothing would have survived those 6 days intact: the maintenance logs, Orun's nerve, the platform's own willingness to let anyone poke around unsupervised. The delay wasn't incidental to the cover-up, Amara. It was the cover-up. That's the thing this council still doesn't like to hear plainly, even 5 years later." Reyes Alvarez, quieter than either of them, only said, "Ainsley would have hated the attention today, you know, all this ceremony. He'd have wanted us just to keep working." "I know," Marsh said. "That's exactly why we're doing both." She stepped through into the Cradle of Voices, and the session began, the ancient chamber's frozen light settling around her shoulders the way it had settled around Ainsley's years before. in a version of this same room that had once believed patience alone would be enough. 5 years ago, she said, this council let 6 days pass without opening a single inquiry into the murder of a man who had spent his career trying to protect species smaller and weaker than his own trading partners. I do not stand here today to relitigate that failure. I stand here because the charter that followed it has, in 5 years, done exactly what it was built to do, not once, not twice, but 11 separate times, for 11 different species, none of them large enough or wealthy enough to have commanded this council's swift attention on their own merits alone. The most recent of those 11 invocations, barely 4 months old, had involved a junior MREN trade observer found dead under circumstances the observer's own collective had immediately suspected of foul play, aboard a station administered by a species with far greater commercial leverage than the MREN's fungal collective could independently command. Where a similar case might once have drifted for weeks under the same procedural fog that had once buried Ainsley's death, the Rapid Inquiry Charter's 48-hour window had forced a formal investigation open before evidence could be quietly lost to routine maintenance. And the resulting inquiry, concluded within 6 weeks rather than 8 months, had ultimately cleared the administering species of wrongdoing entirely. A finding Marsh considered every bit as important a vindication of the Charter's purpose as any conviction would have been. The Charter was never meant to presume guilt, she had said more than once in the years since its passage. It was meant only to guarantee that the truth, whatever it turned out to be, would not be buried under the weight of someone else's trade relationship. She had met the MREN observer's own surviving collective node briefly, in the weeks after that inquiry closed, and had been struck by how simply they expressed their gratitude, not for the exoneration itself, which they had genuinely wanted, but for the mere fact that someone had been made to look quickly and honestly, rather than being permitted to look away. She looked briefly toward the delegate benches where the Threx Assembly's new civilian trade envoy sat, a careful, soft-spoken delegate named Vesic Thorn, no relation to Vorn beyond a shared hive lineage that Threx custom required be publicly disclosed, sent by a confederation that had spent 5 years rebuilding a reputation one broker's ambition had nearly destroyed, and who had in the past 2 years personally championed the very forensic transparency standards that had once been used to convict his own species' former trade delegate. Thorn had reached out to Marsh privately, in the weeks before the anniversary session, requesting a brief meeting that neither had publicized to their own delegations. He had told her in that quiet conversation that he had joined the Assembly's Civilian Trade Council specifically because Vorn's downfall had convinced him that a confederation built entirely around commercial advantage, with no internal check on how far that advantage could be pursued, would eventually produce another Vorn, and then another, until the entire Assembly's standing among the Accord collapsed under the weight of its own unaccountable brokers. I did not know Ambassador Ainsley, Thorn had said. I have read everything about him I can find. I would like to think that if he had lived to see what came after his death, he would have found some use in it, even if he never would have chosen the cost. He had gone on in that same conversation to describe the quiet, unglamorous work of the past 5 years from his own side of the border, persuading skeptical Hivelders that transparency standards were not a humiliation imposed by a rival species, but a genuine safeguard against the Assembly's own W. Orst instincts building meeting by patient meeting, the kind of internal accountability that Vorn's decades-long rise had shown, in retrospect, the Assembly had never possessed. We are not the same confederation we were 5 years ago, Thorn had said. I do not know if that is enough to call it repair, but it is, I think, a beginning your Ambassador Ainsley would have recognized as worth the patience it took. Justice delayed by procedure is not justice postponed, Marsh said, returning her attention to the full chamber. It is justice denied wearing the costume of patience. I learned that lesson at a cost I would not wish on any delegation in this chamber, and I have spent 5 years making certain this council never again mistakes bureaucratic delay for the neutral, careful deliberation it likes to imagine itself practicing. Thomas Ainsley believed, until the last conversation I ever had with him, that proof cost less than the alternative. I have spent 5 years proving he was right, even though it cost this accord 6 days it can never get back and cost me a colleague I never had the chance to properly say goodbye to. She paused and the chamber held its silence, waiting, the way it always did now when a human delegate reached the end of a sentence that mattered. A council chose silence over an inquiry and called a murdered man's diligence overzealous, Marsh said. 1 week later, we stopped asking this body for permission to protect our own, and this accord has been a little more honest and a little less able to hide behind its own procedure ever since. The chamber held the silence a moment longer, and then, tier by tier, ring by ring, the delegates of the Thralis Accord rose, not in ceremony, not on any signal, but in the slow, unplanned way a room rises when it recognizes, all at once, that something true has just been said, and that the truest thing left to do is simply to stand and let it settle. Clara Ainsley, seated near the chamber's edge, rose with them and found to her own quiet surprise that she was not crying, only watching, the way her father had once taught her to watch a difficult negotiation reach its final, hard-won conclusion, not with relief exactly, but with the settled recognition that the work, however long it had taken, had finally been done correctly. Somewhere below, near the base of the spiral, Vesic Thorn remained seated a moment longer than the delegates around him. His silver head bowed slightly before he too rose. And Marsh, watching from the podium, understood that gesture as clearly as she understood anything that day. An acknowledgement offered without words from one species to another that some debts could never be fully repaid, only carried forward with as much honesty as the carrying allowed.